Our gospel lesson this morning is taken from Mark chapter 8, verses 31 through 38. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." This is the word of God for us, the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Please be seated. So in the beginning, in Genesis, we see that God makes a deal or a covenant with Abram, who we know mostly as Abraham, because it's customary that when something significant happens in your life spiritually, you would change your name, signifying that there's a change in your life. And so Abram becomes Abraham, and Sarai becomes Sarah, because God promises them that they're going to be the parents of this great, great nation. They will have multiple children, a huge nation, kings. It will be a huge clan. But there's a slight blip on the road. Abraham is 99 years old. Sarah is beyond childbearing years. That seems a little odd. Yeah, a little odd. And so God promises them this, and Abraham is ready, and they go off on this journey, on this road that God has asked them to be on, fully believing that God would fulfill the promises that God made to them. They had faith that somehow the things that we define as human limitations would be overcome by God. Well, they're on the road, and they're traveling, and things just don't seem to be happening like God said. Have you ever been there? Yeah. You know, you're like, God, we had this deal going on, we had things, we were planning how we're going to walk this road together, but you know what? You're not keeping up your end of the deal, or maybe I misunderstood it. And so it's interesting to follow Abraham and Sarah on their journey, because actually Abraham tried to give Sarah away twice to save his own skin. Husbands, are you all laughing? And there was a problem that Sarah remained barren. There was still not one child to start this great nation that they had been promised. God said, "Follow me, and this will happen." But it didn't seem like it was happening the way that they thought it was going to happen. So they took matters into their own hands, and they said, "Well, we're supposed to have an heir, and by our custom that if I have an heir by one of Sarah's handmaidens or her slave, it can be the heir of this great nation that God is going to give us." Have you ever tried to think about, well, God, this isn't the plan that I thought we were doing, and so if I do this, I think that fulfills it? Yeah. Some of you know where I'm at. And so they do this, but was that No. And sometimes God takes a long time, right? God's plan takes a long time, a lot longer than we're used to things happening, right? We want things now. And I have to think that Abraham and Sarah were not of our understanding of what now was. You know, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have drive-through fast food, they didn't have all of those conveniences that make us individuals who want things right now. So I feel that they give us a little bit of slack because they were ones that I'm sure understood time in a different way. Things take longer. And yet, they were on this unbroken road that God had set before them in terms of God proclaiming God's love and gathering all people into God. And yet, they veered off just a bit of that plan. Trying to fulfill it, but off just a bit. And then we get to our gospel lesson. And the Gospel of Mark opens up with, anyone? You guys know that now I have these prizes I'm going to give you if you know the answers to these. So maybe read it. So the Gospel of Mark starts up with, follow me. Follow me. A simple invitation to those disciples, follow me. And so there's something about this rabbi that these disciples decide to leave their life behind and follow Jesus on this road, this rabbi. They're sensing maybe something special about this rabbi, and so they leave behind their old life and they follow him. And as they're following him, as they're spending time with Jesus, they're starting to realize things about this particular rabbi. That on this road, things are starting to be revealed to them that this might be the one. This might be the Messiah. And so right before our gospel lesson that I just read this morning, we have that come to Jesus moment. Where Jesus says to the disciples, who do they say that I am? And the disciples then go through, this whole rhetoric about who everybody says that he is. And then Jesus asks the pointed question. Who do you say that I am? Because they've been following him as this rabbi, this wandering rabbi that I'm sure had great charisma, that was speaking and doing wonderful things. But here comes the moment when he's no longer a rabbi and he's asking the disciples, who do you say that I am? And the disciple, which one? Peter says, you are the Messiah. Peter has this epiphany, this clarity of understanding who Jesus is. You are the Messiah. Okay? Then we move to our scripture. So Jesus is like, okay, they got that understanding. We went from follow me to you're the Messiah, to here I'm going to give you a little bit more about the plan. And Jesus lays it out for them. Jesus says that I'm going to be tortured, things are not going to happen the way, I'm going to be crucified. It's not going to happen the way I think you think it's going to. So he lays it all out, and I always remember that at the end he says what? But in 3 days, I'll rise again. So I think the disciples kind of get lost in this whole sense that the Messiah, the one that is coming to save us, is going to be persecuted, ridiculed, killed. But how can that be? Because they have a cultural understanding of what the Messiah is about. And how many of us have our own understanding of what God and Jesus is about and doing in the world? Oh my gosh, I failed. If you don't have, do you have an understanding, a knowledge of what? Okay, you better call the bishop and get another one in here because what? So we have an understanding of who Jesus is, right? Right. Okay. not how we're having this happen. This cannot be. And then Jesus calls Peter Satan. He calls Peter Satan. And I think, again, with the writing of that, we know that the Gospels use hyperbole, they use clues, but what this does for us, it helps us to hearken back to the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. Because remember that the tempter, Satan, to the tempter, was trying to get Jesus to veer off of the road that God was setting before him. You know, take the easy way out and veer off of that road. You can still accomplish kind of the stuff that you were sent to do, and maybe not have to go through all the other stuff that God required of you. So in this moment where Peter and Jesus are having this dialogue, Jesus stops him and helps us to look back at this tempting, because Peter is doing the same thing, trying to veer Jesus off the path that God has set before him. Veering off the path, that unbroken path that God has set before us, so that all people will know of God's love and God's salvation. We have to recognize that sometimes we feel like God's path for us is broken. That this cannot be the path that you want me to walk. This is not the path that we agreed on, or I had conjured up in my head that we agreed on. This is broken. But what we do in the season of Lent is we reflect on how is it that we might be called off of that road that's unbroken and might veer from it. How is it that we might be tempted to get off that path that God's laid before us? And we have time in Lent to do that. And so, what is it that we commit ourselves to each day? I know, just getting out of bed in the morning and getting out Brian's coffee. Or making it down to the coffee pot so that you can start the day. But what is it that we commit ourselves to every single day? What? Follow Jesus. That's great. That's great. I'm not so sure, Noelle, that I do that every day. You know, sometimes I get so focused on getting to the coffee pot and feeding the cats that I don't even think about Jesus. Or getting the kids to school. Jesus loves cats. Jesus. What? Oh! Okay, we're going to do a sermon about cats. But that question is before us. What do we commit ourselves to each day? And I know that every one of us in this room is busy beyond all get out, right? We are overscheduled. We are overrun. We are multitasking on Facebook all the time. Oh, sorry, that's just me. And yet there's that simple question. What do we commit ourselves to each day? Do we commit ourselves to being on that unbroken road, fighting against those temptations, or identifying those temptations that want us to swerve off the road that God has put before us? Who do we say Jesus is? I wonder how our day would change if each day we woke up, and I really am going to say this, before we had coffee, asked ourselves, what am I going to commit myself to today? Yeah, we'll have all of those responsibilities still. Getting the kids to school. Is that easy? I just want you to know that they wanted to be mic'd up for this service. You know, the NFL mic'd up. Can you imagine how much fun that would be? See how easily I get sidetracked? So what is it? So ask yourself that question. What is it that I'm going to commit myself to today? How am I going to follow that unbroken road and committing myself to God, to Jesus? There's this really interesting story that the Reverend Jane Hunt tells in one of her sermons about this passage. And it was Ash Wednesday. And as often happens, as pastors, you'll get a call on Ash Wednesday that certain people in the hospital would like ashes, the imposition of ashes. And a lot of times hospitals now have chaplains who go off and do the imposition of ashes for those who are in the hospital who want them. But this particular call came for this pastor, and so she got there and checked in with the chaplain's office, and they said, you know, where is the place that I'm taking these ashes? And they told her the maternity ward. Often, no, that's not the place where we're called to take the imposition of ashes. It's often those who are at the other end of life on this earth who are requesting the imposition of ashes. So she goes to the maternity ward, she walks into this room, and there's a family there gathered with a woman who's about to give birth. And the woman who was about to give birth said, "Hi." And this pastor was curious, like we all are. So she said, "Why the imposition of ashes right now? You seem a little busy." And the lady that was about to have the baby said, "Because it's Ash Wednesday." Because it's Ash Wednesday. And that causes us pause to think about, in the midst of life and giving birth, new life. It wasn't a situation where there would be tragedy. This was going to be a happy delivery, a new family, new life. But in the midst of that, the woman said, "What am I committed to? I'm committed to God." So this is just amazing because the word imposition of ashes is what we call it. Imposition is not a nice word, is it? No. It means that this is imposed on us. Wait, I did look it up, so I want to read to you the definition. It means that it is a burden, a nuisance, an annoyance. So the imposition of ashes is a burden, an annoyance, because it reminds us of our human limitations. It reminds us that from dust we came, to dust we will go. So the juxtaposition of this woman who's about to give birth and the imposition of ashes really gets at the meaning of what it means to be focused, asking that question, what am I committed to, even in the midst of giving birth, even in the midst of being busy with bringing forth new life. She remembered. She remembered who she was. And in that same instance of remembering who she was, and when we remember who we are, we have the grace that we remember who God is and who Jesus is. That God's road through Jesus is unbroken. God's road through Jesus is unbroken. So we're not left to think that the broken road is God's plan for us, because it's not. Even when it looks when it looks broken. God is planning. God is working for us to understand and see that it's not broken. And that's where we get some of the practices, some of the things that help us to stay on that road. And today, communion is one of those. Communion helps us to come to the table in the midst of our journey and experience God